Hi, I'm Barb Buller, and this is the recent history of reading instruction for my Eastern Washington University Master's in Education class 591. The history of reading instruction reflects the evolving understanding of how humans learn to read and how societies value literacy. In ancient times, reading was a skill reserved for only a select few, the elite. In the modern era of universal education, methods for teaching reading have continually adapted to cultural, linguistic, and technological changes. Early approaches emphasized rote memorization and oral recitation, while later methods incorporated insights from psychology, linguistics, and educational research. Over time, debates have emerged, highlighting differing beliefs about the best way to teach reading. Understanding the historical development of reading instruction not only reveals shifts in educational theory, but also helps educators appreciate the roots of contemporary literacy practices and policies. The first historical event is the publication of Jean Chall's Learning to Read: The Great Debate. In the 1960s and 70s, reading instruction was changing. Influenced by earlier critiques, educators began exploring the whole language method. This approach taught reading in a natural, meaning-based way, combining phonics with real reading experiences. The whole language emphasized learning to read through immersive experiences using stories and contexts, and encouraged students to use social, cultural, and visual cues, not just decoding words. Chall reviewed years of research and found that systematic phonics instructions was more effective than the whole word instruction methods. Her book continued the national debate between the phonics and whole language approaches, highlighting the need for evidence-based instruction in teaching reading. Chall believed that scientific research wasn't being applied in classrooms. She criticized the lack of structured phonics in the whole language method and called for more research, especially to support struggling readers and those with dyslexia. The second historic event is the whole language movement, which began as a new way to teach reading based on the idea that kids learn best by reading real books and making meaning from what they read. Whole language believes that reading should be learned like speaking, naturally and in context. The focus was on meaning, stories, and student voice rather than teaching phonics and skills in isolation. The belief that phonics teachings were too focused on drills and memorization was the reason for the whole language movement. This movement encourages students' choice, student-led learning, creativity, and real reading experiences. Though critics argue that whole language downplays or neglects direct phonics instruction, which is essential for helping students who struggle, especially those who struggle, to decode unfamiliar words. Many students, including those with dyslexia or reading difficulties, need that systematic and explicit phonics instruction. Whole languages focus on learning through context alone isn't enough for those students. While some students succeed with the whole language, others fall behind, and this sometimes leads to wider achievement gaps and declining test scores. The third historical event, Becoming a Nation of Readers publication, declared that reading aloud to children is the single most important activity for building reading success. It emphasized the need for balanced instruction, including phonics, comprehension, fluency, and vocabulary. It also reinforced the value of early literacy development through exposure to language and books. This book influenced teachers' education, classroom practices, and federal reading policies. It also laid the groundwork for later reports like the National Reading Panel. It stated that reading aloud to children is the most important activity for building reading success, emphasized balanced instruction, including phonics, comprehension, vocabulary, and fluency. It was published during the height of the phonics versus whole language debate and written as a response to concerns about declining reading achievement and the need for research-based guidance. It was part of the broader push in the 1980s towards education reform and accountability. Critics report that though it promoted balanced approach, it was sometimes interpreted inconsistently, and some schools leaned too heavily on either phonics or whole language. The teachers and districts often cherry-picked recommendations, leading to uneven results. It never settled the debate of the phonics versus whole language, and it didn't offer strategies for students with learning difficulties such as dyslexia. The fourth historical event is the National Reading Panel Report. This report, or panel, reviewed over 100,000 studies to find what was most effective in reading instruction. It identified 5 essential components of effective reading instruction, the 5 pillars: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. National Reading Panel, or NRP, became the foundation for federal programs like Reading First, also teacher training and curriculum development. The growing movement known as the science of reading marked a shift toward evidence-based literacy instruction across the U.S. In the 1990s, the U.S. faced growing concerns about low reading achievement and inconsistent teaching practices. The federal government wanted to base reading instruction on scientific evidence, not ideology or tradition. The phonics versus whole language debate was still active, creating division in schools and teacher prep programs. In response, Congress asked the National Reading Panel to review research and identify what actually works in teaching children to read. The findings gave strong support to systematic phonics, leading many to reject whole language as insufficient. Some of the criticism of this report is that educators felt that the report promoted a one-size-fits-all model that doesn't fully consider the importance of motivation, engagement, and culturally relevant teaching. And although it identified what to teach, it didn't always specify how to teach it effectively across these diverse classrooms. The fifth historic event was No Child Left Behind Act, or NCLB. It required states to assess students' reading skills annually in grades 3 through 8. It directed billions in federal funding toward programs using evidence-based reading practices, especially the phonics-focused instruction. It made scientifically based reading research a standard for curriculum and teaching practices. It also raised the national awareness of the importance of early literacy and reading proficiency by 3rd grade. This act marked a turning point where federal policy began directly influencing classroom instruction in reading. NCLB passed in response to growing concerns about educational equity and low reading achievement, especially among the disadvantaged students. Built off of the National Reading Panel findings, it emphasized scientifically based research in education and aimed to close achievement gaps and raise standards in the U.S. schools through accountability and testing. Critics argued that NCLB prioritized systematic phonics at the expense of other important aspects of literacy, such as reading comprehension, writing, and motivation. And the law's heavy focus on standardized testing led to teaching to the test and narrowing curricula, while increasing pressure on students and teachers. The sixth historic event is the Reading First initiative. It was launched as a major initiative under No Child Left Behind, and it was developed in response to the National Reading Panel's findings. It targeted early elementary grades K through 3, and especially in low-performing schools. It provided over $1 billion in federal funding to states and districts to implement research-based reading programs. Reading First Initiative, or RFI, promoted the use of programs aligned with scientific reading research and emphasized systematic phonics and phonemic awareness. It made widespread changes in curriculum and teacher training and reading assessments. Critics argue that RFI focused too heavily on phonics, often at the expense of comprehension, vocabulary development, and critical thinking. And teachers reported a loss of instructional flexibility as they were following scripted curricula. Evaluations from the federal government showed some gains in decoding skills, but limited impact on reading comprehension, raising questions about the overall effectiveness. The seventh historical event is the Science of Reading movement, or SOR. This is based on cognitive science, neuroscience, and decades of reading research. It promotes evidence-based reading instructions aligned with how the brain learns to read, reinforces the importance of explicit teaching of phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. SOR strongly supports structured literacy, which is especially effective for students with dyslexia or learning challenges. SOR provides a unifying framework to guide reading instruction beyond traditional phonics versus whole language divisions. And critics argue that some schools adopt the science of reading as a label without understanding and implementing it correctly, leading to inconsistent and superficial changes. Some critics raise concerns that the narrow focus on foundational skills may overlook culturally responsive teaching in the diverse linguistic backgrounds of students. The eighth historic event is the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was signed into law in 2015 and replaced NCLB, or No Child Left Behind Act. It gives states greater flexibility in shaping education policy while maintaining federal accountability for student achievement. ESSA responded to widespread criticism of NCLB's overemphasis on standardized testing and its one-size-fits-all mandates. While they retained the focus of closing achievement gaps, it granted states more control over how they assess student performance. It concentrated on emphasizing evidence-based practices, providing early literacy initiatives, providing state flexibility, and focusing on closing achievement gaps. Critics argue that this increased state control can lead to a patchwork of reading standards and practices, with some states adopting strong evidence-based practices while others continued less effective models. This inconsistency could widen rather than close those achievement gaps. The ninth historical event is dyslexia legislation. This led to statewide mandates for early screening for signs of dyslexia, often in kindergarten through second grade. It also provided teacher training in identifying and supporting students with dyslexia and the use of structured literacy and intervention programs based on the science of reading. Public awareness about dyslexia and reading struggles was raised. This legislation focused on early intervention, aiming to prevent long-term reading struggles. Affecting up to 1 in 5 students, dyslexia is a common underdiagnosed reading disability. The critics argue that screening tools may over or under-identify students, and that schools are not equipped to provide follow-up support for all flagged students. And there are concerns about inconsistent teaching training, with some programs lacking depth or fidelity to structured literacy models. Final historical event is the post-pandemic literacy push. COVID-19 caused major disruptions to in-person learning, with early elementary school students hit hardest in reading development. National test scores showed significant declines in reading proficiency, especially among low-income and minority students. This sparked urgency in policy responses at state and federal levels to improve early literacy outcomes and close widening achievement gaps. It was built on the momentum from the Science of Reading movement and the existing dyslexia legislation trends. It led to renewed national focus on early literacy as foundational for academic recovery. Some states like Mississippi and Tennessee passed laws to mandate evidence-based reading instruction and require teacher training in the science of reading, and to provide early screening and intervention from struggling readers. Critics question whether this quick policy change and widespread teacher retraining can effectively change classroom practice, especially without long-term support. Many teachers were trained under older models and may resist or struggle with adopting structured literacy approaches without adequate support, and concerns about whether high poverty and under-resourced schools have the capacity to implement these reforms equitably. Overall, the history of reading instruction reflects a shift from unstructured, context-based approaches to more evidence-based phonics-focused methods, driven by the ongoing debates over the most effective ways to teach reading.